Ever notice how a single vote can expose a political divide that looked unbreakable just days earlier? That's exactly what happened in Washington. For months, the debate over the SAVE Act seemed locked into a familiar pattern. Republicans strongly in favor, Democrats firmly opposed. Then something unexpected happened. Not one, not five, but 13 House Democrats crossed party lines and voted in favor of legislation tied to the SAVE Act. Suddenly, a debate that looked completely partisan became far more complicated. For political strategists in both parties, those votes raised a much bigger question. Was this simply a handful of lawmakers breaking ranks on one bill? Or was it the first visible sign that the politics surrounding election security are beginning to shift in ways few expected? The SAVE Act has become one of the most closely watched election-related proposals in Congress. Supporters argue it would strengthen confidence in federal elections by requiring documentary proof of U.S. citizenship when registering to vote in federal elections. Critics, however, argue that such requirements could create additional barriers for eligible voters who may have difficulty obtaining or presenting the required documents. Those competing arguments have defined the debate for months. But regardless of where people stand on the policy itself, the latest House vote changed the political conversation. Instead of focusing only on Republicans versus Democrats, attention quickly turned to why some Democrats decided to support the measure despite opposition from many party leaders. Timing also played a major role. The vote came as Republicans intensified their effort to move election security legislation through Congress, while President Donald Trump continued urging lawmakers to prioritize the issue. Republican leaders have argued that election integrity remains one of the top concerns among their voters, making the SAVE Act a major legislative priority. Democratic leaders, meanwhile, have largely maintained that existing federal law already prohibits non-citizens from voting in federal elections and have questioned whether the legislation addresses a widespread problem. That disagreement has fueled months of heated debate both inside Congress and across cable news. But politics often changes when lawmakers begin paying closer attention to public opinion. Recent polling has suggested broad public support for measures such as voter identification requirements, although public views become more divided depending on how specific legislative proposals are written and implemented. Those numbers have led some analysts to argue that election security may be becoming a more politically difficult issue for both parties to ignore. That brings us back to those 13 votes. Were they isolated decisions made by members representing competitive districts? Were they responding to shifting voter attitudes back home? Or do they signal that both parties are beginning to rethink their political strategy heading into the next election cycle? Whatever the answer, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. This wasn't just another routine House vote. It instantly became one of the most talked about moments in Washington because it challenged the assumption that party lines on this issue were completely fixed. And the story doesn't end in the House. The next battleground is the Senate, where Republicans face a much tougher path. The outcome there could determine whether the SAVE Act becomes law, stalls indefinitely, or forces both parties into another high-profile political showdown. Before the Senate even casts a single vote, though, it's worth understanding exactly why these 13 Democrats broke ranks, because their decision may reveal far more about America's changing political landscape than many people realize. The answer may seem obvious at first. Many commentators immediately framed it as a victory for one party or a setback for the other. But Washington rarely works that simply. Members of Congress don't just vote based on party loyalty. They also vote with one eye on the people who send them back to Washington every 2 years. And that's where this story becomes much more interesting. Most of the Democrats who supported the measure represent districts where elections are often decided by only a few percentage points. In competitive districts, every issue matters. Lawmakers aren't just trying to satisfy party leadership. They're trying to convince independent voters that they're willing to break from party lines when they believe it's necessary. Election security has increasingly become one of those issues. Poll after poll has shown that many Americans, including a significant number of independents, support measures like verifying voter identity or confirming citizenship before registering for federal elections. While people disagree on how those policies should be implemented, the broader idea of protecting election integrity consistently receives support across different demographic groups. That creates a political dilemma. If a lawmaker opposes every election security proposal outright, opponents can argue they're ignoring voter concerns. But if they support stricter requirements, they risk criticism from activists and party leaders who believe those measures could make voting more difficult for eligible citizens. For months, Democratic leadership largely maintained a united front against the SAVE Act. Their argument has been consistent. Federal law already limits voting in federal elections to U.S. citizens, and they contend that additional documentation requirements could unintentionally affect eligible voters who don't have immediate access to certain records. Republicans see it very differently. They argue that requiring documentary proof of citizenship creates another layer of confidence in the election system and helps ensure voter rolls remain accurate. To them, it's less about changing who can vote and more about verifying eligibility before someone is added to the rolls. Those competing narratives have dominated the debate since the bill was introduced. But when 13 Democrats voted across party lines, the conversation shifted almost overnight. Instead of asking whether Republicans had enough support within their own conference, political analysts began asking a different question. What convinced these Democrats to break ranks? Some observers believe it reflects changing political realities back home. Others point to the growing importance of suburban swing districts, where independent voters often decide elections. In those districts, projecting independence from party leadership can sometimes be just as valuable as supporting a particular policy. That's why this vote carried symbolic weight far beyond the final tally. It suggested that at least some Democratic lawmakers may believe the political landscape around election security is evolving. Whether that represents a lasting shift or simply a tactical decision remains to be seen, but it was enough to get Washington's attention. Republican leaders noticed it immediately. For months, many believed the debate would remain sharply divided along party lines. Seeing Democrats cross over, even in relatively small numbers, gave supporters of the legislation a new talking point. This was no longer being backed exclusively by Republicans. That matters because perception often shapes momentum in Congress. Once a bill begins attracting bipartisan support, even if limited, it can change how undecided lawmakers evaluate the political risks of supporting it themselves. Sometimes, momentum becomes just as important as the vote count, and that brings us to the next phase of this fight. Because the House vote may have generated headlines, but the Senate is where the legislation faces its biggest test. With procedural hurdles, narrow margins, and intense political pressure, the battle over the SAVE Act is about to become far more unpredictable than anything we've seen so far. But if House Republicans are celebrating, they also know the hardest part still lies ahead. Passing legislation through the House is one thing. Getting it through the Senate is an entirely different challenge. Unlike the House, where a simple majority often determines the outcome, the Senate operates under a maze of procedural rules. Even legislation with majority support can stall if lawmakers cannot overcome procedural hurdles or agree on the path forward. That's why every vote and every senator suddenly becomes critically important. Senate Republican leaders have made it clear they want to keep the momentum alive. Their argument is straightforward. If the House has once again approved legislation tied to election security, the Senate should give it a full debate rather than allowing it to fade away during the congressional recess. Several Republican senators have publicly pushed for continuing work before lawmakers leave Washington, signaling they don't want this issue delayed until later in the year. President Trump has also continued urging congressional Republicans to prioritize election-related legislation, keeping pressure on Senate leaders as they weigh their next move. But even with Republican control of the chamber, success is far from guaranteed. Every senator brings different priorities, different constituencies, and sometimes different opinions about strategy, even when they generally agree on policy. Some Republicans strongly support the substance of the SAVE Act, but have previously raised questions about the legislative process being used to move it forward. Others have emphasized that election-related legislation should receive broader bipartisan backing before becoming law. Those procedural disagreements may sound technical, but in Washington they often determine whether legislation succeeds or fails. And Democrats understand that as well. While many House Democrats oppose the measure, Senate Democrats are expected to continue arguing that existing federal law already limits voting in federal elections to U.S. citizens. They maintain that additional documentation requirements could create unnecessary obstacles for eligible voters without addressing a widespread problem. That means the debate is no longer just about policy, it's about persuasion. Republicans now have to convince enough senators that moving forward is worth both the political and procedural risks. Democrats, meanwhile, must decide whether to maintain a united front or whether the House vote signals that some members may begin viewing the issue differently. Political observers are watching closely because Senate dynamics often change rapidly once pressure begins building. Lawmakers returning home hear directly from constituents. Local media start asking questions. Advocacy groups launch advertising campaigns. Polling shifts. Suddenly, votes that once seemed locked in become far less predictable. That's exactly why the House crossover vote attracted so much attention. Even though 13 Democrats represent only a small portion of the Democratic caucus, their decision created a new narrative. Bipartisan support, however limited, now exists. In Washington, perception can influence momentum almost as much as the numbers themselves. For Republican strategists, that's an opportunity. For Democratic leaders, it's a challenge, because once members begin breaking party lines on a high-profile issue, reporters inevitably start asking who might be next. And that's where another factor enters the story: public opinion. Behind closed doors, lawmakers often pay just as much attention to polling as they do to party leadership. If voters increasingly view election security as a priority, politicians in competitive districts and states may begin adjusting their positions accordingly. Whether that's already happening is the question everyone in Washington is trying to answer, and the latest polling numbers are adding an entirely new layer to this political battle, one that neither party can afford to ignore. If there's one thing politicians respect, it's numbers. Campaign speeches make headlines, party strategy shapes the message, but polling often tells lawmakers what their voters are actually thinking, and in a politically divided country, that's the data neither party can afford to ignore. Over the past several months, multiple national surveys have shown that election integrity continues to rank as an important issue for many voters. While Americans remain divided over the best way to protect elections, broad support has been reported for ideas such as verifying voter eligibility and requiring identification at the polls. Support levels vary depending on the exact wording of survey questions, but the overall trend has attracted attention from strategists in both parties. That matters because members of Congress don't just campaign to their party's base anymore. In today's political environment, many elections are decided by independents and suburban swing voters. Those are often the voters who determine whether a representative keeps their seat or packs up their office after Election Day. Political consultants understand this better than anyone. When internal polling begins showing that voters are shifting on an issue, campaign strategies usually shift too. Messaging changes, advertisements change, sometimes even votes begin to change. That's one reason some analysts believe the crossover votes in the House weren't simply random acts of independence. They may have reflected a broader political calculation. Imagine you're representing a district where every election is decided by 2 or 3 percentage points. Your constituents don't all think alike. Some are lifelong Democrats, others are Republicans. Many don't identify strongly with either party. Winning re-election often depends on convincing those middle-of-the-road voters that you're willing to think independently rather than automatically following party leadership. A vote on election security becomes more than just legislation. It becomes a message that says, "I'm listening to my district." Whether voters interpret that positively or negatively depends on their own views, but politicians rarely ignore what they believe their constituents are telling them. At the same time, Democrats face another political challenge. Their leaders have repeatedly argued that non-citizen voting in federal elections is already illegal under existing law and that safeguards are already in place. They also warned that additional documentation requirements could create unintended barriers for eligible voters. Republicans counter with a different argument. They say if confidence in elections is important, then strengthening verification requirements increases public trust in the system. They argue that clearer standards can help reassure voters regardless of whether widespread fraud is occurring. That's why this debate has become one of the defining political battles in Washington. It's no longer just about one bill. It's about competing visions of how elections should be administered and what reforms, if any, are necessary moving forward. And that's exactly why those 13 Democratic votes generated so much attention. Not because they changed the final House outcome by themselves, but because they hinted that political incentives may be evolving beneath the surface. If more lawmakers begin reaching the conclusion that supporting certain election security measures carries less political risk than opposing them, the conversation in Congress could gradually begin to shift. Will that happen? No one knows yet. Congress has a long history of moments that appeared to signal major political realignments, only for momentum to disappear weeks later. At the same time, some of the biggest legislative changes in American history began with a relatively small number of lawmakers willing to break with expectations. That's why Washington is watching the Senate so closely. The next vote won't simply determine the future of one piece of legislation. It could reveal whether the bipartisan support seen in the House was an isolated event or the beginning of a broader shift in how both parties approach one of the most closely watched issues in American politics. And if that shift continues, the political consequences could extend well beyond the SAVE Act, influencing campaign strategies, messaging, and perhaps even the next election cycle itself. So while the headlines focus on 13 Democrats crossing the aisle, the bigger story may be this. Washington is entering another moment where political assumptions are being tested in real time, and everyone is waiting to see which side adapts first. If this trend continues, the debate over election security may look very different just a few months from now. What happens next could determine whether this was simply a headline or the beginning of a much larger political shift, because once the House completed its vote, all eyes immediately turned to the Senate. This is where legislation often faces its toughest test. Bills that move quickly through the House can spend weeks or even months navigating Senate procedures, negotiations, and competing priorities. Every vote becomes more significant, and every senator comes under greater scrutiny. Republican leaders are expected to continue pressing for action, arguing that election integrity remains a priority issue for many voters. Democrats, meanwhile, are expected to continue raising concerns about the bill's potential impact on eligible voters and questioning whether additional federal requirements are necessary. That means the debate is far from over. In fact, it's probably just entering its most important stage. And there's another reason this Senate battle matters. Lawmakers aren't operating in a vacuum. Every vote they cast today will almost certainly appear in campaign advertisements tomorrow. Supporters of the SAVE Act are likely to argue that they voted to strengthen confidence in federal elections. Opponents are likely to argue they voted to protect voter access and prevent unnecessary barriers for eligible citizens. Both sides know exactly how this issue will be framed during the next election cycle. That's why even a relatively small number of crossover votes can have an outsized political impact. Think about the message those 13 Democrats sent. Whether they supported the legislation because of personal conviction, district-level politics, or broader electoral strategy, they demonstrated that this issue is no longer producing perfectly predictable partisan outcomes. That alone changes the conversation. Political reporters start asking different questions. Party leaders begin reassessing strategy. Campaign consultants update their polling. and lawmakers in competitive districts begin paying even closer attention to how voters are reacting. Washington has seen this pattern before. A handful of unexpected votes can trigger conversations that eventually reshape an entire legislative debate. It doesn't guarantee the bill becomes law, but it does signal that political assumptions are evolving. That's why both Republicans and Democrats are watching the next steps so carefully. If additional bipartisan support emerges in the Senate, supporters will argue that momentum is building. If the legislation stalls, opponents will point to the Senate as proof that significant concerns remain unresolved. Either way, this isn't just about one vote anymore. It's about the broader political narrative heading into the next election season. Can Republicans successfully make election security one of their defining campaign issues? Can Democrats persuade voters that existing safeguards are sufficient while addressing concerns about election confidence? Or will both parties eventually move toward some form of compromise? Those questions remain unanswered, but one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The vote by 13 House Democrats has ensured that the SAVE Act is no longer just another bill moving quietly through Congress. It has become one of the most closely watched political battles in Washington, with implications that extend far beyond the legislation itself. Whether you're following this story from the perspective of election policy, campaign strategy, or congressional politics, the next few weeks could prove pivotal. Because in Washington, momentum can change quickly, and sometimes a single vote, or in this case 13, becomes the moment everyone looks back on as the point where the conversation started to change. As the Senate prepares for its next move, one question now hangs over Capitol Hill. Was this simply a temporary break in party unity, or the first sign of a much larger political realignment? Only the next round of votes will provide the answer. If you've enjoyed this breakdown, let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you think the bipartisan support we saw in the House is the beginning of a lasting trend, or was it a one-time political calculation? As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.